I just think about just not being able to be where I am or continue to do what I do without the wisdom, knowledge, experience of those that have come before me.
Advocating for civil rights, organizing labor strikes, protesting against war. For decades, Asian Americans have organized and fought back against oppression, inspired by other movements led by people of color.
Freedom, freedom, freedom.
Throughout history, Asians have been subjected to colonialism and imperialism, creating cycles of trauma. But now, generations of Asian Americans are using their different experiences to reclaim the past by building solidarity with other marginalized communities.
I grew up in multicultural neighborhoods. And so I was always kind of like, hanging around with other people of color, or they were always at school. But yet I had a strong Japanese American family life. And so when I was in college, there were some older guys, and they used to kind of hang out once a week in the back room of Ben Yano's bar on Arlington. This is back in the day, like 60s. I was always really curious about that. So I went one night, and the people that they had there were the Brown Berets and the United Farm Workers Organizing Committee people. And then the Brown Berets were talking about, the issues at school and what the police were doing, in their community. And for me, at that time, there were no organizations or, social justice movements, for people my age. And so I was like a party girl, And after hearing what those people were doing, it was like a light bulb went off. And it was like everything fell into place. And my parents didn't know it, but I, quit school, and I just went to work full time for a while for the, farm workers, in the office, and got to be friends with some of the Brown Berets who took me to their, to the marches and to the rallies.
I was so lucky to grow up with my aunt's influence, just steeped in these stories and knowing about this history, and just like having it be something that like I wasn't even able to really appreciate until later, because it was just like so much a part of my life and how I was taught to see the world. That started to become more apparent to me as I've gotten older, and as I've like navigated working in the art world, which is what I do. So like beginning to see how the art world orients itself politically, and like figuring out how I wanted to orient myself in that was kind of like how I moved towards being more actively involved in community organizing and with other people who I know from, the Little Tokyo community who have had similar experiences to me.
I was taught activism from the way that my parents and my grandparents lived. My grandparents, my grandfather especially, was a member of the Sikh community, and core values of Sikhism are justice, are dignity for all people, are equality. And while maybe as a young person I'd never thought about it that way, clearly our way of life demonstrated that.
The thing that I remember most when I think about activism was the way that I saw parts of my identity being received by different parts of my community, how my parents perceived of my queerness, how my queer friends perceived my race. And so looking at intersectionality and talking about, unlearning the different traumas that we have as our different identities really became the core of what I became interested in. And I think once I started, in middle school and high school, seeing other communities that weren't South Asian and the ways that they manifested their activism, I think I began to look at organizing differently. And so it's been important for me to center both the ancestral traditions of communal care that are in activism, but also challenge them, because those are often steeped in their own biases.
The Asian community is not a monolith. According to the Pew Research Center, a record 23 million Asian Americans trace their roots to more than 20 countries. And for activists, bridging the gap means building more paths toward unity.
Perhaps some of our traditions and the ways that we've been taught to think no longer serve us. How do we begin to both undo that thinking, but also support people where they are? Because, what a 65-year-old Indian woman like my mother can understand, and how maybe needs to be brought along looks a little bit differently for me in my 30s, maybe looks a little bit differently for folks that are born here and raised here.
I live with my parents, I live with folks who are past their middle ages. And so they have different understandings, right? And they bring with them different experiences growing up, traumas that my mom or my dad has witnessed or experienced or absorbed, and then the ones that I have seen and absorbed. And being able to see both and, I think, is really integral to knowing that we as a family, we can build together if we acknowledge multifacetedness of what truth can look like for people.
It is really important to look at each of our communities because we've had different histories. A lot of our Asians have come over maybe after the war, and many in our Asian Pacific Islander Native Hawaiian community don't know that there was an Asian movement before, that there were, people that really had to fight internally for some of the programs that we and institutions that we have now. It's important for us to learn more about each other because it's not all in those textbooks in Asian studies. It's more in the lives of their parents and their families and people that we work with today.
I think just having like a really self-reflexive attitude and just like always thinking about what our position is and like how we can use that position to draw from our experiences and to center ourselves, but like the struggle, and that's like the shared thing.
I would hope that every generation both looks back as Indigenous practice teaches us to garner and to really be rooted in the past, but also looks ahead to the futures, the generations that come after us, and are thinking in that way in anything that we're doing.